Forced my voice. So thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to share about someone that has meant a lot to me in recent years, actually. I know a few people have said they've never heard of Flannery before, and I really hadn't heard a lot about her either until fairly recently, so I'm excited to share a little bit about her with you. One of the things, because I always forget to mention it, I contributed to this book called The Catholic Mom's Prayer Companion, and why I wanted to especially mention this, it just came out in the fall. It's put out by Ave Maria Press. It's a book of daily reflections, and towards the back, if you do have a copy or end up with one, there's a little reflection. I've done 4 different reflections in here. It's made of 80 different writers from across the United States. One of them has a little reflection on Flannery, so it's on November 16th. So if you do get a copy of this, it's a beautiful little treasure. I enjoy it as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and start here and share about Flannery. So she has been someone that has increased my deepening understanding of who I am in God's eyes, and I hope that after today's presentation, you will feel a little bit of that as well, and maybe go deeper into her writing. Indeed, the one named Mary Flannery O'Connor, who later became known by her middle name, Flannery, intimately knew the Father's love, for her own father had been taken from her as a teenager. And as she could see that her own days would be numbered by the same disease that had claimed his life, lupus, her dependence on God and understanding of his mercy grew. Now, I'm assuming that at least some of you have heard about Flannery, and perhaps a few of you know quite a bit about her. Maybe you've even read some of her short stories or even her famed collection of letters, The Habit of Being. This large volume, which is a legacy of her life, has been read and enjoyed by many, and not just in the Christian realm. For Flannery was a devout Catholic, but by the literary world as well. I know a few friends that studied her in their English classes in college or high school. And while I can only scratch the surface today of why her life and writing has resonated so deeply with so many in her short lifetime, I hope that my introduction of Flannery, based on my own experience, will bless you. I was first introduced to Flannery O'Connor about 15 years ago through an online Catholic writers, freelance writers support group of sorts. Within that circle, I kept hearing this name, Flannery O'Connor, and I'll admit I felt a bit sheepish since I hadn't come across her work before. Wanting to catch up to properly enter that conversation, I found a copy of her debut novel, Wise Blood, and began to read. However, as I went along, I kept scratching my head. I could not figure out the fascination over this writer. This story, at least, confused and even disturbed me, and was in some ways repugnant. Could my Catholic writer friends, whose tastes usually aligned with mine, be that misguided? What I later came to understand is that Flannery, very purposefully, attempted to depict a world lacking grace in order to demonstrate how very much in need of it we are. When read in that light of that understanding, her fiction makes sense and truly has something important to offer us. In addition, her grasp of human nature was profound, and it's one of the reasons, I think, why that first work bothered me. Through it, I was put in touch with my own human weaknesses. Flannery had nailed it. We humans need God. But not understanding that initially, I knew that I had to dig some more, so I invested next in her letter collection, feeling that surely the secret to the odd fascination over Flannery would be revealed in her written conversations with editors, friends, and others she met along her journey. Indeed, within the first few pages, my highlighting pen came out with vigor. I was hooked. I found her astute in matters of faith and fascinating in her articulation of the writing life. Her exchanges with editors and other writing friends, as well as conversations with them about what she was reading and what about it was affecting her, or in some cases what she found distasteful, brought interesting insight and informed about the times in which she was living, the 1950s and early 1960s. Consider that she had been placed in the context of living out a deeply Catholic life in the Protestant South. I quickly became endeared to Flannery O'Connor. Finally, I understood what all the exclamations from my Catholic writer friends were about. And then, in the summer of 2014, I was offered a rare opportunity. Through that same group, an excursion was proposed that we travel on the 50th anniversary of Flannery's death to her hometown of Milledgeville, Georgia, and to the farmstead, Andalusia, where her mother, Regina, a widow who raised dairy cattle, with assistance from an on-site family of African-American laborers, had lived. In time, the pieces came together, and did I get ahead here? There we go. That's the Hill House. That was the house of the laborers. In time, the pieces fell together for three of us to take part in what we called the convergence. Two from Wisconsin and I, the North Dakota component, traveled by car to Kentucky. I'd flown there ahead of time with my mother to visit a cousin, and then I joined the Wisconsin gals in Christina's blue car, which she called Lucy, in Springfield, Kentucky, the birthplace or the place where Abraham Lincoln's parents were married. And the three of us made our way through the state and eventually to Flannery's hometown of Milledgeville, which was the pre-Civil War capital of Georgia. There we were, three Northern Catholic sisters and writers, discovering the Deep South together and confronting the ghost, if you will, of our heroine, Flannery O'Connor. And there we are in the upper right-hand corner. Interestingly, a lot of people have thought Christina looks a little bit like Flannery. She's the one on the left. So before I bring you along on some of that journey today, let me pull anyone who doesn't know anything about Flannery up to speed. In a nutshell, she was born on March 25th, 1925, and in time became an important voice in American literature, having written 2 novels and 32 short stories, as well as numerous reviews and commentaries. She was a Southern writer who often wrote in a Southern Gothic style, relying heavily on regional settings and, as some would describe them, grotesque characters. Her writing, reflecting her Roman Catholic faith, frequently examined questions of morality and ethics. Her posthumously compiled complete stories won the 1972 U.S. National Book Award for Fiction and has been the subject of enduring praise. Flannery died at the age of only 39 on August 3, 1964. That's the short version of Flannery, but there's so much more to her, and it was an honor discovering Flannery and some of the very places she'd trod and fashioned her stories around. Just before writing this talk, I asked my 2 travel companions, Christina and Karen, how they would sum up what Flannery means to them, particularly when calling to mind the theme of this conference, beloved daughter. Christina, the youngest of us, said the word privilege comes to mind. Quote, "The privilege we have to be so loved." Flannery had a lot of privilege in her life, such as the privilege to write books and spend her days at the typewriter, while her mother's hard labor on the farm provided her a place to live and be inspired and properly cared for during the worst days of her illness. In what ways are we privileged daughters of the Father, knowing His providence in our lives? Karen, the eldest of our trio, said she thinks of the word love when calling Flannery to mind in this way. "I think of the many facets of love that came to her through her many friendships with priests, religious fans, and friends. She was well loved by many, and Regina loved her enough to bring her back home so she could care for her in her last years. She was very loved. And aren't all these people all a reflection of the Father?" Indeed, Flannery was a privileged soul, initially through having come into the world with at least some worldly wealth and advantage. The only child in her family, she was not surprisingly adored. As biographer Brad Gooch writes in Flannery, A Life of Flannery O'Connor, as a young mother, Regina pushed her coveted only child around in a stroller of sorts, a perambulator fashioned of wood, with a long swan's neck metal handle and an adjustable protective hood of slatted wicker with portholes on either side, all painted in the same cream color. The elegant focal point was a monogram of the new baby's initials, MFOC, embossed in gold on the side. Later, her privilege would be seen in other ways, but all was not rosy either. Catholic school bred in her earliest years, Flannery was well exposed to a life of privilege in knowing the Lord, but she was also described by some, and herself at times, as a misfit. Though she, for the most part, didn't care, and later even used it to her advantage in creating characters, others certainly did pay attention to it. A childhood friend, for instance, recalled that whenever the two would be in a group together, Flannery would stand on the side and watch. Remembering Flannery as self-reliant but remote, a cousin of hers recalls how Flannery wore corrective shoes and moved about with a distinctive kind of loping walk. Another peer remembers her plodding along, often walking with her hands behind her back, just clumping along, thinking about something, who knows what. Even as a 6-year-old in Savannah, Georgia, I keep getting ahead of myself, sorry about that, I'm not sure. Even as a 6-year-old in Savannah, Georgia, the siblingless Flannery spent hours alone in her upstairs bedroom, bathed in quiet, with her coveted supply of crayons and papers to help bring to life the pictures in her mind, especially of animals, particularly birds. Little had changed by her teen years when she often retreated into her long, narrow, high-ceilinged bedroom overlooking a backyard where Flannery kept geese and her mother planted daffodils. There, she whiled away countless hours on her stool at a high-legged clerk's desk, drawing and writing. Sometimes she would even escape to a vast attic room full of trunks and chests and with a front gabled window that looked out over Green Street to the cemetery and beyond, from Flannery a life. But where some saw a recluse, I see an introvert whose inner life was so rich and expansive that for long bouts of time, she had little need of outside stimulation. The imaginative world of Flannery's mind, which we wouldn't glimpse until much later, kept her amply entertained and satisfied. So what was it like to visit her world all the way from North Dakota? Our journey began at a bed and breakfast in Springfield, Kentucky called Cinnamon House, where another of our Catholic writer friends, a Kentucky native, joined us for just those first days, preparing homemade meals with food from her garden. The gift of friendship deriving from a wellspring of faith became an indelible part of our journey. The way we cared for one another and how easily we laughed together, and keep in mind we didn't know each other until this weekend, and the privilege of worshiping our Lord in the same spaces really made this adventure a beautifully spirit-fused one. While in Kentucky, we visited the Trappist monastery, Abbey of Gethsemane. This is where famed writer and monk Thomas Merton crafted his best-selling 7-story mountain. God alone was the motto.
That was a great book.
Yes. Eventually traveling through the beautiful Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, we wound our way down to Georgia, deeper into the south, where we met Southern charm. We stayed in the Antebellum Inn, which is in the right-hand corner. It was absolutely wonderfully lavish, and had a chance to worship at the very church where Flannery and her mother used to attend daily mass, a structure that had actually been erected by Flannery's own family and where, inevitably, she was ushered into the next life. Our trip also included a taste of, you gotta eat while you're in the South, right? Fried catfish and fried green tomatoes, which are yummy. A visit to the museum where Flannery's relics are housed, i.e. her typewriter. And ultimately, it brought us to the Milledgeville Cemetery, where we had a chance to pray at her grave and feel truly connected to her spirit. But let's not go to the grave just yet. Flannery has so much to teach us about living as beloved daughters and how to do this well. There are 3 transcendentals of the church that draw us into the life of faith in a compelling way, and today earlier we got a taste of some of the beauty that brings us in, the goodness and the truth. I like to focus also on that third one for a bit, the beauty, which I actually said first. And it seems fitting in a conference tailored toward women, because we are, in a special way, I think, transmitters of beauty in this world, just as we are drawn to it. And one of the most striking ways Flannery brought beauty to us was through her beautiful peacocks. If Flannery is known by nothing else outside the realm of Southern literary fiction, she is at least recognized by many by the exquisite critter known as the peacock. Or, since this is a women's conference, we might not want to be prejudiced, the peahen. In 2015, the year after my literary journey, a new stamp emerged bearing Flannery's image, and of course it was fashioned with the peacock colors, theme, and design, which are so fun. Flannery and peacocks are simply synonymous, Just Google Flannery's name and the images burst forth, connecting us to the writer whose material was as rich as the colors of her favorite bird's majestic fanned tail at the height of a mating ritual. In a reprint of her book of short stories, Everything That Rises Must Converge, Flannery's dear literary friend Robert Fitzgerald introduces her book by sharing about his own visit to Andalusia, noting, "There are maybe a dozen or 20 peacocks in sight, fabulous in throat and crest, to say nothing of the billowy tinsel train behind." After a visit to her farmstead in 1959, her editor, Robert Grow, wrote about the peacocks he observed, how they roost at dusk by gradual hops from ground to fence post to tree limb, how their trains get caught under car wheels because they refuse to hurry, how vain they are, they seem to jockey for good angles when they saw my camera, how funny it is to see the peachicks rehearsing with their immature feather duster tails, and how rare it is to see the ultimate display when the peacock shimmers and shakes his feathers in a kind of ecstasy at the height of preening. This is in Complete Stories. By the way, from this point onward, you'll know which quotes are Flannery's by my imperfect but determined attempt at a Southern dialect. My most sincere apologies to Flannery for any inaccuracies in translation. It's not surprising that peacocks also show up as characters in Flannery's fiction. In her story, The Displaced Person, a priest arrives on the scene, commenting on the peacock who greets him with a tail full of suns. Later, another character in the story, Mrs. Shortley, confronts a peacock, but distracted, misses the gift of it. As narrator of the fictional scene, Flannery describes it thus: "He had jumped into the tree and his tail hung in front of her, full of fierce planets with eyes that were each ringed and green and set against a sun that was gold in 1 second's light and salmon colored in the next. She might have been looking at a map of the universe, but she didn't notice it any more than she did the spots of sky that cracked the dull green of the tree." There's no doubt that peacocks have plenty of personality. But they also have something to teach us about ourselves and how exquisite we are in God's sight. Flannery knew their sounds well, too. When writing to her Dominican friend, Sister Julie, in June 1962, she remarked, "My head peacock sends you the tip of his feather, which he regrets to say he lost in battle. I have too many cocks for the number of hens, and they do nothing but fight all day. They scream all night, but I don't even hear them anymore." Another time, Flannery had sent a feather to a friend in place of a book she'd wanted to send but had lent out. Instead, she offered, "A genuine work of the Lord, a feather from the tail of one of my peacocks." Flannery added that the peacock is a great comic bird with 5 different screaming squawks, with eyes in its tail that symbolize the eye of the church. I have a flock of about 30, so I am surrounded. The quirkiness and beauty of both Flannery's birds and her writing extrapolate a fitting association. Each presents oddities of our world with a heavy side of grace, and in the end, we can't help but be won over by both. But before the peacock, Flannery's first love entered her life. A bird less regal. In Flannery, A Life of O'Connor, Brad Gooch tells of our heroine's first brush with fame at age 5, when her tan bantam chicken pet, that purportedly could walk backwards, summoned the interest of a newsreel company in New York City. She was living at the time in her birthplace of Savannah, Georgia, and a cameraman from the company traveled there to capture the phenomenon. Not only did the chicken fail to perform under pressure, but the cameraman, exhausted after many attempts, reportedly made a hasty exit, refusing even to enjoy a dish of ice cream that was offered him. A short reel telling the story bears the title, "Odd Fowl Walks Backward to Go Forward so She Can Look Back to See Where She Went." Flannery seemed to walk backwards at times too, and yet few would argue that her life as the chicken's was an unworthy experiment. She later credited the encounter with the cameraman as having inspired her lifelong fowl collection, which eventually expanded from just chickens to, at Andalusia, geese, ducks, swans, and finally, a miracle of nature, the enigmatic peacock. Flannery speckles her letters with vivid tales of her feathered friends, bringing Andalusia to life. My 9 Muscovy ducks have been taken over by a bantam hen, and their mother has gone on about with her social life, which contains in much tail wagging with the 2 drakes, she wrote to her friend Betty Hester in April 1963, adding with a sly gleam, no doubt, I figure I should have 9 more in 3 months. To another friend, a couple months later in the spring, she commented, this is the best season around here. Everything hatching or squawking or strutting. The other day I went out the door and counted 14 peacocks with their tails up. In our debut visit to Andalusia, the peacocks dazzled as much as amused us. Their sideways glances calling to mind one of Flannery's well-known utterances. I can with one eye squint and take it all as blessing. About midway through our healing stroll along the hallowed grounds, the same haunting voice I'd remembered from childhood summoned the 3 of us to the edge of a peafowl pen. Please don't feed or frighten the birds. The posted sign seemed as though it could have been written by Flannery herself, and I sensed her standing off to the side, shaking her pointer finger at us to make sure we treated her birds properly. During her time there, the peafowl had numbered as many as 50, but at our visit they'd been skimmed down to just 3. The male, manly pointer, named for a character in one of her fiction pieces, and his 2 lady friends. As we lingered at the cage, mingling with their spirits, it was as if we could feel Flannery through her beautiful birds.
How come this woman looks so familiar? Is this it's not Flannery?
No, this is just...
Descendant of Flannery?
She's just a friend that went on the trip with us. She looks like Flannery. Yes, she does. Manly, the male, especially seemed to be performing for us, jumping onto the wooden ledge so we might admire him. After we sensed we'd taken enough of their time, we meandered away, ending at the gift shop where a vase with peacock feathers from the Andalusia grounds awaited. Happily, I selected 5, right here, 1 for each of my children. From that point on in our trip, these feathers were a coveted item and barely escaped being crushed in the overhead compartment in the plane on the way back to North Dakota. They did survive, I'm happy to say, a tangible reminder of the joy that Flannery's birds once brought her and how their antics helped put her trials as a dying woman in perspective. My Miss Colby duck has set 3 times this year and presented me with her last hatch on Labor Day, Flannery wrote in a letter to John Hawks on September 10th, 1963. She runs to holidays, the first hatch coming off on St. Patrick's Day and the second on Jefferson Davis's birthday. So you see, everything is in great harmony here. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Flannery's peacocks was their spiritual symbolism. As Christina, one of the travel companions, noted in an essay after our trip, because of his ability to transform himself into glory, the male peacock has been a symbol of the transfiguration of Christ in the Christian tradition. And Flannery was no stranger to that symbolism. At the sight of the peacock in the displaced person, the priest, with jaw gaping, exclaims, "Christ will come like that!" Karen, our other sojourner, beautifully explained in her own writing following our trip the connection between Christianity and the peacock. And I'm going to read her essay here. Flannery's love affair with these mystical birds is a worthy complement to her Catholic faith, as ancient Greeks believed that the flesh of peafowl did not decay after death. Consequently, it became a symbol of immortality and was later adopted by Christians. Additionally, early Christian paintings and mosaics utilized peacock imagery, and peacock feathers can be used during the Easter season as church decorations. St. Augustine used the peacock to symbolize the resurrection, and the peacock is often tucked in among the animals in nativity displays. Other than devouring a few undesirable insects, the peacock served no real function in this purpose-driven world. but what they do is to reflect a smattering of God's pure magnificence, just for beauty's sake. Since their feathers shed each year, the peacocks are also a gentle symbol of renewal and rebirth. For me, a repentant sinner, the idea of rebirth, renewal, and starting over is very appealing and a loving gift from God. The visual reminder is the perfect remedy for the moments that I am too hard on myself. When we are offered brief instances in our lives, such as this, Karen continues, where our breath is taken away, where suddenly nothing is explainable even for an instant, I like to believe that it's a whisper from heaven. The eyes on the plumage are reminiscent to me of the eye of God watching over all of us. The sensory encounter with Manly, Hulga, and Mary Grace, the peahens at Andalusia, was an exercise just in being and enjoying nothing but the remarkable beauty, and so like our generous God who desires to lavish us with splendor. While productivity is a grand attribute, God does not always require this of us. And I think when we open our senses with the eyes of a child and stay in awe of his handiwork, he smiles. Above all, today, I want you to know that when God gazes upon you, beloved daughter, he stares in wonder and awe and love, so pleased at who you are, even when you have done nothing more than simply be. This doesn't mean, however, that there isn't a need to find purpose in our lives, and simply being is the way that we ought to experience God's eternal abiding love for us. It comes without effort on our parts, just as those of us who are mothers had no expectation of our children in order that we would love them. We loved them simply because they were, and they were ours, beings that had not existed before, but because of our yes would now exist throughout time. Throughout the history of humanity, we have asked the question, why am I here? What is my purpose? Flannery was no exception, and especially when her life did not go as planned, certainly then, she had to dig even deeper to discover that purpose. Indeed, Flannery's life seemed to have been going along quite swimmingly when lupus began to invade. Physical obstacles required a plan B. Rather than live out her life in the thrilling writing community of New York where she had gone after college, she had no choice but to go back to Milledgeville, Georgia, and spend her days on a dairy farm with her mother, Regina. And this is the very grounds of Andalusia. A little bit of the dairy aspect.
Are they using that as a museum, kind of?
Yep.
Yeah.
It is kind of still being built, actually, so it's still very in its prime. We got to peek at some areas that are maybe not open to everyone. Of course, God could see further. He knew, and in time, so would Flannery, that her writing career would not only take off, but flourish, while restricted to the red earth grounds of Andalusia. Inevitably, it was here, this is her bedroom, where Flannery and her typewriter became one. It was an extension of her, an object that connected her soul with the rest of the world in a mysterious, life-giving way. In a letter to Betty Hester on December 9th, 1961, Flannery wrote, "Writing is a good example of self-abandonment. I never forget myself completely except when I am writing, and I am never more completely myself than when I am writing." Writing became an essential way for Flannery's diminishing body to transcend its dire limitations evermore as the year progressed. As her world began to narrow, her biggest concern was that her fingers still worked and that she could place them upon the keys of her machine. "As far as I'm concerned, as long as I can get at that typewriter, I have enough," she wrote to a friend just weeks before her death. That same week, she wrote to another that, having just come home from a discouraging stint at the hospital, she was finally getting somewhere again with her writing. "I have to stay in these 2 rooms, but Regina has got me the table with the electric typewriter on it put, so I get out of bed and into the typewriter, so to speak, and every day I'm able to do a little more." She was downright territorial about her writing tools, including the desk that held the typewriter that collected her thoughts. She told her friend Betty in August 1963 that while her room had always been subject to intrusion, One thing that was not at risk was her desk and her typewriter. "Nobody lays a hand on that, boy," she quipped. During our adventure in the South, Karen, Christina, and I had discussed more than once how Flannery's illness had been an essential aspect of her success. Though she'd already established herself as a writer outside of Andalusia before her lupus began to flare up, it was Milledgeville where her stories began percolating to the point of becoming eternally enduring. We all agreed to the merits of this. The idea that our sufferings, the unwanted things that we saw as annoyances or worse, might just become the very things that in the end would free us. Somehow Flannery found a way to not let her disease stop her. And while she didn't have most of the conveniences we enjoy nowadays in the way of technology and communication, she had just what she needed to make her world work. Helpful though they were, her writing tools remained secondary to the creative stirrings that became encapsulated through the clacking of keys. As always, for Flannery, the act was a spiritual one, connected to God himself. "It's the moment of grace that makes a story work," she'd said. Another time she remarked that God does not care anything about what we write, but that he uses our words in the way he sees fit. "So much the more reason, I think, that we have to give him the best we've got for his use and leave the uses to him." For Flannery, the act of writing came organically. "When I write, I do what I have to with what I can," she wrote in May 1963. "You are always bounded to what you can make live." At the same time, she made no qualms about the difficulty of the writing process, once noting that her major problem in life was simply finding the next word. And yet she came to know the craft so well as the type of person most attracted to it, as evidenced by these comments after a hospital stay. "By now, I know all the student nurses who want to write. If they are sloppy and inefficient and can't make up the bed, well, that's them. They want to write." Guilty as charged. But it wasn't just writing that gave Flannery purpose. Rather, it was the relationship she made through her writing that kept her going. One might wonder how this seemingly shy, recluse of a girl could possibly have developed into a woman so rich in friendship, and yet that is exactly how things unfolded in the life of Mary Flannery. Initially, though she was reluctant to step out too far. In a letter to Carolyn Gordon Tate on December 1957, while referencing an upcoming trip to Lourdes, France, Flannery commented, "You are more sanguine about this pilgrimage than I am. It's not that I'd rather be a tourist, I'd rather stay home." Another sampling of her introverted tendencies comes after she'd been invited to speak at Spring Hill, a Jesuit college in Mobile, Alabama. Flannery seemed reluctant to go, telling a friend that she was struggling in part with what to say. Referencing an article that Betty had sent her about coffee, she said, "I may reuse some of the coffee grounds, like Father McCown's mother, who uses them over and over until they turn white and serves them for grits." But after forcing herself out of her comfort zone, she found herself pleasantly surprised. "Spring Hill was peachy. I enjoy these things once I get there." Flannery's ability to extract new relationships from these opportunities often offer a privileged peek into her soul. Through her correspondences, we learn that people mattered most to Flannery, even above her writing. And we see an ill-fitting child transforming into a butterfly. For there is no doubt whatsoever that by the end of her life, Flannery was both coveted friend of many and someone who deeply cherished her friendships in turn. She still has much to teach us in this realm. Though practical about her writing work and what needed to be done each day, Flannery always allowed herself time to celebrate with friends, whether through letters or in-person encounters. As her illness progressed and her movements became more restricted, rather than giving up on these relationships, Flannery sought them even more vigorously, extending one invitation after another for others to join her world. "I wish you could come and see us. We have a lovely place, as evidenced by my reluctance to leave it for 17 days of holy culture and pious exhaustion," she wrote to Carolyn Gordon Tate. To Father J.H. McCown, she offered,
Well, your mother sounds just like my mother. You should bring her down sometime, as I feel sure there is nothing they wouldn't agree about. And in a letter to Betty Hester in October 1957, after complaining of not having seen the sun in 9 consecutive days, Flannery writes, "There should be a break in this weather sometime, and we would like you to come down if you could spare a Saturday during October and November, or if you and your aunt could drive down some Sunday and have dinner with us, we'd love to have her." In this frequent stream of invitations to Andalusia, one can't help but see signs of the basic human need to love and to be loved. For just when it seemed she'd reached her quota of friends, another would emerge, and at precisely the time Flannery seemed to need them most. Janet McCain didn't arrive in the scene until 1963, not far from Flannery's death, and yet she became a prominent friend at that crucial time. Here I go again, going too fast. This was a package. When we went on a tour, we got to go upstairs, which was normally cut off from visitors, but they let us go up. And we just could kind of look around in the upstairs. And this was a letter from Janet McCain to Flannery that was just on a desk. So I just was like, oh, it just felt so close to the time when we were there. That Flannery would continue to draw so many varied people to herself despite illness and even growing fame seems to indicate she recognized that these friendships were God's hand in her life. An especially poignant sentiment from Flannery comes just after the eruption of some serious health issues that would claim her life in a letter to McCain that ends, "A real happy new year and many thanks for everything, mostly for being." For being. Flannery, it seems, had discovered one of life's greatest lessons, that it is simply our being here at all that matters most. She'd also discovered what has been described in Scripture in Sirach 6:14-17. "A faithful friend is a sturdy shelter. He who finds one finds a treasure. A faithful friend is beyond price. No sum can balance his worth. A faithful friend is a life-saving remedy, such as he who fears God finds, for he who fears God behaves accordingly, and his friend will be like himself." Flannery's ability to draw people in and together has not ended in her passing. 3 strangers merging in a cramped car on a trip covering hundreds of ground miles could have resulted in disaster, even with our basic commonalities and collective love for Flannery. Instead, with God at the center of our friendship and Flannery peeking around his shoulder with a sparkle in her eyes, we found ourselves bound together, quite possibly into eternity, where we all hope to be with Flannery again together, for real, for the very first time. So we've got Peackoks and purpose, and now we've reached the third portion of our discovery of Flannery this afternoon, perseverance. When one reads Flannery's letters, one can't help but be taken in with the reality that it is the diary of someone who is inching closer and closer to death. And not only that, but death at what seems the prime of her life. Knowing the ending before I began, I knew that on some level, in reading her written exchanges, I was learning from her not only about how to live, but how to die. And one cannot learn about Flannery without coming to see that humor was one of her greatest tools and gifts. It was one of the ways she coped, persevered, and thrived. Though we may not all possess the gift of humor as did Flannery, certainly we can all see, as the adage goes, that laughter is often the best medicine. In her embrace of life, she delighted and prodded at human nature, which is what makes her fiction so relatable. Having read many of her works before the trip, the 3 of us seemed naturally to bring this part of her spirit into our adventure. Even before meeting, texts back and forth included addressing one another as honey child and sweet pea. We were eager to fully immerse ourselves in Flannery's South for a spell. At Cinnamon House, it became apparent how laughter would mark our trip, as Karen and I caught sight of a framed quote displayed in the entryway and mused together at W.B. Yeats' famed words, "The Irish have an abiding sense of tragedy that sustains them through temporary periods of joy." Like Flannery, Karen and I both claim Irish blood, and in an instant we understood. "Ah, ain't it so?" Karen said, admiring the plaque. "Truer words have never been spoken," I responded, solemnly shaking my head and smiling. Flannery delighted too in the surprising humor that often arrived in unexpected places. In a letter to her friend Janet McCain in June 1963, she described a statue she'd seen during a visit to the cloisters while living in New York. "As I remember, it was about 4 feet high and on a pedestal," she recounted. "It was the Virgin holding the Christ child, and both were laughing. Not smiling, laughing. I've never seen any models of it anywhere, but I was greatly taken with it, and should I ever get back to the cloisters, which is unlikely, I mean to see it if it is there." Flannery's description of this holy mom and babe, and the realization that, of course, they too enjoyed moments of not just solemnity, as is usually depicted, but knee-slapping laughter, brought me closer to them both in an instant. That Flannery was struck by this too makes sense, given what I've come to know of her. For she knew well that humor can be a great grace, and used the knowledge expertly in her stories and in life. The gift of laughter, after all, comes first from God. Throughout our trip, we unwrapped the gift again and again, as ready laughter fused together our wondering and our worrying. I'd like to think it was Flannery who set the tone with her funny, bone-tickling observations, which we shared along the way. She must have been in a ticklish mood, for instance, while writing A Stroke of Good Fortune, a short story in which this description comes. "Standing up straight, she was a short woman, shaped nearly like a funeral urn." Another doozy comes up near it when she writes, "Well, he had about as much gid as a floor mop." Her humor erupts just a few paragraphs later when she mentions the name of a character's husband, Bill B. Heel. It seems Flannery enjoyed tongue twisters too. In another of her stories, Flannery narrates her character's words and motions thus. "Do you know what's happening to this world? It's swelling up. It's getting so full of people that only the smart, thrifty, energetic ones are going to survive." And she tapped the words smart, thrifty, and energetic out on the palm of her hand. Through her hammering out of human nature in this way, as we read Flannery, we can't help but laugh at ourselves most of all. Now, while her stories carried this flair, in her personal letters, one might expect more heaviness, and yet we don't see complaints coloring her notes to friends. At one point, in fact, Flannery declared, despite her chronic affliction, that she'd never suffered a day in her life, and humor pervaded. Yet Flannery understood well that there was a time to laugh and a time to be solemn, such as at the consecration at Mass. Despite the playfulness that followed us throughout our journey, we also grasped that at times our most sacred surroundings required respectful restraint. This was no more true than at our very last destination, the Holy Spirit Monastery in Conyers, Georgia, a place where Flannery and her mother had visited more than once, and where we experienced our journey's exhale in a most surprising fashion. Upon arrival, it was abundantly clear, looking at the vast structure before us and all the accompanying markers, that silence was the order of the day. Exploring the Conyers Chapel for the first time, I felt the slowdown deep in my bones. Perusing the sanctuary, light streaming through colorful stained-glass windows, yellows up front by the altar and blues by the main body of the nave, I was held in a holy trance. From the back of the cathedral, I observed a solitary monk. He's on the left there. In a pew just feet from me, his bald head, white alb, and sandaled feet iconic, yet undoubtedly real, and connecting in that moment to a real God. I sensed I was meant to witness this moment, private as it was, if for nothing else, to carry the peace home. We'd experienced so many of these beautiful, quiet pauses during our explorations of the grounds, and had held it up all so well, but one cannot sustain such a posture forever. At some point, the soul cannot bear it up, and sound must necessarily pervade the silence. For us, it was the perfect storm. At the end of our travels, we had little resolve left. Add to that the reality of a marked time at the monastery every evening known as the grand silence, and we were toast. As we gathered one night, the last night, in one of the small cells where we were to sleep, we were like children summoned to be quiet during church. It was as if Flannery herself had pulled out a peacock feather from her store and begun brushing it under our noses, and it would be just like her to do such a thing. I don't remember who was first to let loose, but at some point, a chorus of chuckles commenced. Adult though we were, our tired, full spirits caved. Holy laughter had beckoned. We'd learned from the best after all, and having spent all this time in Flannery's world, her knack at turning the seriousness of life into a much lightened load had rubbed off clean onto our weakened psyches. As we wiped tears from our smile-creased eyes, I thought of the monks in a quiet room not far from where we were, and I couldn't help but wonder if whether a few through the years, like we three in that moment, had lost their solemn composure a time or two as well during the grand silence. I also have to believe that in those moments of humbled humanity, God let out a holy howl. There's no doubt that Flannery's propensity to see the world with an eye for the humorous had infected our souls. She taught us that it is a gift from God. The key seems, though, not so much how she chuckled at others, but how she did so not only after taking a cold, hard look in the mirror and laughing hysterically at herself. She was acutely aware of her flaws. Early on, Flannery was called out for being a poor speller. Her 7th grade teacher noted on her final report card that year that Mary Flannery needs to work on her spelling. Several years earlier, at age 10, Flannery created a collection of vignettes poking fun at her family titled My Relatives, and the cover of her journal from age 12 warned in a passive-aggressive sort of way, I know some folks that don't mind their own business. When a teacher tried correcting her spelling around that time, Flannery shrugged it off as unimportant. It continued into adulthood. Flannery referred to herself once as a very innocent speller. Though inertia may have accounted for some of Flannery's spelling errors, others seemed intentional. It wasn't unusual to see Catholic as Catholic and government as government. In her letters, even though we can assume she knew these words well, other times she seemed generally perplexed by certain grammatical issues. In one postscript in a letter to a friend, after receiving some confusing editing advice, she remarked, "Well, I thought a bloody semicolon was for a long pause. What is it for?" In the end, however, she seemed to accept this flaw, and to her book editor, upon submission of one of her writing pieces, Flannery once wrote, "Just spell the misspelled words right, I'd never know the difference." By the time of her death, however, Flannery seems to have come to a beautiful maturation with a confidence that had arrived in part from having achieved so many of her goals as a writer, but even more perhaps from finding her true identity as a beloved daughter of the Father. Her ability to persevere certainly was aided as well through her friendship with her mother, Regina, who, despite being a true stronghold for Flannery, also rubbed her the wrong way at times. There's no doubt the two had a very close relationship, attending daily Mass together often, and in their years apart, staying in regular contact. But bound as the two were to one another, there seemed a healthy tension in their relationship as well. Some of Regina's offhand comments, at least as relayed by Flannery, might be labeled by my own daughters as snarky, even if subtly so. Like those from February 28, 1960, when Flannery tells of a painting that she's trying to create to fill in an open space in the wall of a new addition to the farmhouse. Every now and then my mother comes and looks and says, "Well, now I like that. That's my kind of painting. I can tell exactly what that is," which makes me feel like I'm as good as Eisenhower or Churchill, Flannery remarks. Undoubtedly, the O'Connor friction may have been due to part of the unusual circumstances in which they'd found themselves. Flannery's illness had changed the course of her natural trajectory away from Georgia, leaving her with clipped wings, necessitating an unplanned return home. And I suspect this didn't help the balance of harmony at times. But the two also were in obvious need of each other. Flannery depended on her mother's hard work on the farm, which she could contribute to only minimally, and Regina relied on her only child's presence. Flannery was, after all, one of the last viable links to her husband, Edward, yet each required a little space of her own, too. Despite the privileged background, Regina, on the farm and with her daughter's fragile health always in mind, seemed to rise to the occasion of hard-working laborer. Not only did she have all the usual physical tasks before her, but the farm help came with their own issues, and most of the heavy lifting in the emotional realm seemed to fall to Regina. Speaking here of the farm help who lived in a house behind them, Flannery once noted, "We've had a bad week around here. Liquor has been coming in. Wednesday, Louise threw scalding water on Shot, and he had to be taken to the emergency room at the hospital, and he's been more or less out of it all week," Flannery wrote in August 1963. "Louise was very pleased that she scalded him. Later in the day, I asked Regina if she was still pleased with herself, and she said no, she was sorry now that she hadn't killed him." In the end, all the jesting from Flannery gave way to the reality of a divinely fashioned bond marked by sacrifice and a deep mutual love. Exemplifying this are her friend Sally Fitzgerald's remembrances of some of Flannery's final words with her about her mother. On the subject of Mrs. O'Connor herself, I can report a remark that Flannery made to me the last time I talked to her, she writes. She told me that she had fully come to terms with her confinement and with the physical danger in which she lived, and that she had in fact only one great fear, that her mother would die before her. "I don't know," she said, "what I would do without her." I get emotional. Sally added that Flannery's letters are full of Mrs. O'Connor. She is quoted, referred to, relished, and admired, joked with and about, and altogether clearly loved. Flannery seems to have integrated the reality of the passion so deeply that surrender became an extension of how she lived. Not that it always came naturally, but by submitting in body and mind each day and approaching the Lord at Mass, Flannery's genuflection became her habit of being. This is at her church. Even if she wasn't intentionally thinking of it, confronting the crucifix as she did and so often had to have brought immense comfort to Flannery. Dealing with the reality of a failing body, surely Christ's loving submission bolstered her tired soul. There's no doubt the passion formed Flannery, gave her life, and led her further into the lives of others in Christ's sacred heart. Perhaps it began at age 15, while watching her father fade, feeling her paternal stronghold give way. Young though she was, Flannery's awareness that God would be well fit for filling the void may have started taking shape. The realization that we cannot be fixed without first being broken, or find divinity without coming to grips with our own humanity, can be jolting. But having confronted this early and deeply, Flannery gently leads us onto a path too frightening for most of us to start down on our own. In her published prayer journal, Flannery wrote, "Obviously, the only way to live right is to give up everything. If I ever do get to be a fine writer, it will be not because I am a fine writer, but because God has given me credit for a few of the things that He kindly wrote for me." The act of relenting is easy once we understand we're not giving up, but gaining. Flannery found that freedom comes in handing it all over to God, including her writing ideas, abilities, and successes. This made it possible for her to do the same with her very life when the time came. Flannery once said, "Whatever suits the Lord suits me," understanding that seeking God's will daily would bring her to places she needed to be. But how can we know God's will? A few months before her death, Flannery wrote her friend Louise Abbott, closing a brief note with an even briefer postscript. "P.S. Prayers requested. I'm sick of being sick." Her utterance grips us. 2 months to the day she would write her final note, and a few days later breathe her last. Flannery had already surrendered so much, losing the physical presence of her father, a writing career in New York City, the idea of marriage, a life of unencumbered travel, and perhaps forgoing parenting little people for Peackoks. In all of these losses, she was letting go, but rather than turn inward as we might be inclined to do when faced with loss, she grew outward, pouring out her life for others to the end. In her last months, Flannery had begun admitting to suffering without using those words, through asking friends openly for prayer. In these requests, we witness her most successful act of all, falling into the loving arms of God. He'd carried her capably this far after all. Surely he could bring her over the threshold into the next world as well. As I end today, I pray that Flannery's example of living, of loving, and of searching for God despite suffering, and of laughing when the situation calls for it, has inspired you in some way. I pray that it has helped you see, too, that you, each one of you, was chosen by God. You are deeply loved, exquisite and shimmering, and you have a beautiful purpose both in this world and in the one to come. I have two short little clips that I really want to show you if we have time. So.
Here's Mary O'Connor of Savannah, Georgia, holding the only chicken in the world that actually walks backwards. When she advances, she retreats. To go forward, she goes back. When she looks ahead, she's going astern. And when she arrives, she's really leaving. When our trick cameraman started out, he found he could make them all do it. Look at this duck. She won't let any chicken call a foul on her. And good old Bossy. This must be what folks mean when they talk about going back on the farm. Even the old gray mare that ain't what she used to be gets the notion. Naturally, with autos ready to bump through the rear, they're backward about coming forward. Such grace. Just like a canal boat. Well, all's well that ends well, if it's the right end.
So that's what they did about the fact that they couldn't get the chicken to perform. They just did a little magic with the camera. And then I wanted you to hear Flannery's voice. I know I don't match it perfectly, but this is her voice.
This was a good man, hard time. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his tight chair at the table, bent over the iron sports section of the journal. "Now look here, Bailey," she said, "see here, read this." And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. "Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida. And you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that